Good evening, and thank you for joining us for our Latina Equal Pay educational briefing. My name is Dr. Rita Gallardo Good, and I serve as the Vice President of Partnerships and Policy Engagement for the Campaign for College Opportunity and as a Commissioner with the California Commission on the Status of Women and Girls. Although Latina Equal Pay Day recently took place on October 3rd, today I will be moderating this briefing to further discuss the pay disparities, educational attainment gaps, and labor-related challenges for Latinas experience in California. Today, we are joined by our state's most influential Latinas, California Labor Commissioner Lilia Garcia-Brower, and President of the California Labor Federation and former Assembly member Lorena Gonzalez. Lilia Garcia-Brower was born and raised in East LA. She was appointed by Governor Newsom as the California State Labor Commissioner on July 29, 2019. As Labor Commissioner, she oversees a primary law enforcement agency for workplace protections. The Labor Commissioner's office has 19 offices throughout California and employs more than 500 hardworking public servants who investigate and adjudicate a wide range of workplace violations from unpaid wages to retaliation. As Labor Commissioner, Lilia has launched a multidisciplinary outreach campaign reaching every Californian. This campaign prioritizing educating workers' populations who have a history of trauma and do not have a pathway to the LCO. Lilia has also initiated strategies to eliminate retaliation, increase judgment recovery, and criminal prosecution of wage theft. As Labor Commissioner, Lilia commenced a process to make the agency's trauma informed. As part of this process, she established a weekly mediation program entitled A Wellness and Racial Justice Committee, comprised of LCO team members who developed a programming to broaden a social, economic, and racial conscious perspective while nurturing an internal culture of well-being, grow efficient, mission-driven focus, and improve public service. The mission of the California Labor Commissioner's Office is to ensure a just day's pay in every workplace in the state and to promote economic justice through robust enforcement of labor laws. By combating wage theft, protecting workers from retaliation, and educating the public, we put earned wages into workers' pockets and help level the playing field for law-abiding employers. Lorena Gonzalez is the first woman and first person of color to serve as the chief officer of the California Labor Federation, AFL-CIO. She was sworn into office on July 27th, 2022. Lorena's first summer job was with the San Diego Labor very cute. San Diego Labor Council's labor participation nonprofit, handing out food bags to striking workers. She would later go on to become the political director and eventually to be elected secretary treasurer and chief officer of the San Diego Imperial County's Labor Council, AFL-CIO. In 2013, Lorena was elected to the state assembly, promising to fight for California's working and middle class. In 2014, she passed historic legislation to allow every single Californian the ability to earn sick leave, creating a model for the nation to follow. In 2016, she went on to author a law making California the first state in the nation to require farm workers to be paid overtime after 8 hours of work in a day. Lorena also authored legislation to protect janitorial workers against sexual assault and provide professional cheerleaders basic labor protections, both of which became subject of national PBS documentaries. Congratulations. In 2019, Lorena passed Assembly Bill 5, the strongest law in the country protecting workers against misclassification and wage theft. The California Federation of Labor Unions is dedicated to promoting and defending the interests of working people and their families for the betterment of California's communities. From legislative campaigns to grassroots organizing, our affiliates are actively engaged in every aspect of California's economy and government. And so the California Commission on the Status of Women and Girls for more than 50 years has identified and worked to eliminate inequities in state laws, practices, and conditions that affect California's women and girls. The commission is made up of 17 appointed commissioners and provides leadership through research, policy, and program development, education, and outreach and collaboration. In 2022, the commission released the California Blueprint for Women's Pandemic Economic Recovery, the first of its kind, and used an intersectional lens to understand the unique challenges women faced during the pandemic and economic recovery that followed. Latinas entered the pandemic an unequal footing, and the economic challenges they face further widened the wage gap. These impacts have a lasting effect for generations to come. About the blueprint, 28.9% of Latinas experience job loss in California, Community and Labor Center reported at UC Merced. More data shows that the pandemic added an estimated 36 years to the time it will take women to have the same amount as men, bringing the total to 135 years. In California, if all working women and single mothers earn the same as men in comparable roles, the state's poverty rate would be reduced to about 40%. During the COVID-19 recession, more women lost jobs than men. The data shows that among those, Black and Latino immigrant women lost more jobs. More than 6 in 10 Black and Latina women in California live in households that lost employment income during the pandemic, and more likely than men to say that they worry or stressed related to COVID-19 impacts, the negative impacts on their mental health. According to Lean In and McKinsey and Company, only 85 women for every 10 men are promoted to manager. That number is worse for women of color, with Latinas promoted at 71 women to every 100 men. On October 3rd, 2024, Latina Equal Pay Day. This is the day that we acknowledge the number of additional days in the year that Latinas must work to make that of a white man and doing the same exact job. This year, the pay gap stands at 52 cents for all earners, full-time, year-round, plus part-time and part-year, and 57 cents for full-time, year-round workers. Latinas must work almost an entire second year to make that of white men in 1 year. So obviously, this conversation is greatly needed. And so I'd like to ask my panelists, we'll get started. We know that California has made great strides to close the gender wage gap. One of the most recent proposals supported by the commission was SB 1162 by Senator Limon, which expanded the pay transparency for all industries. We know that women oftentimes start at lower salaries, and by having access to salary ranges at the start of the job application process, it allows women to take control of their salaries and determine what is best for themselves. In your experience, what are the most impacted industries where you see pay inequities?
Good
Who'd like to start?
afternoon, Dr. Gallardo. It's so great to be here. It's great to be with my sister Lorena. I got so excited to hear all the wonderful things that she's done in her career. And I know that the Commission on the Status of Women and Girls does important work to bring attention to the experiences of girls and women throughout the state. So I'd like to thank the staff for organizing this event, and for my team and the Labor Fed's team for helping make this possible. In looking at, you asked the question of what are the most impacted industries. And I looked at a recent report, a 2024 report by the Civil Rights Department. And they identified categorically that women are underpaid in all industries. In particular, they noted that in high paid industries, where you would assume a woman executive rises and competes with her peers, but we see this issue throughout. And there's the smallest gap in the lowest paid industries. And with respects to claims filed with my office, we have for 2024, our top industries are healthcare and social assistance, educational services, professional, scientific, and technical. Those are really the biggest ones where we have dozens of claims that are filed. Then we have government, retail, finance and insurance, construction, manufacturing, and restaurant. So similar to what the Civil Rights Department found, we have a sprinkling, right, of these claims consistently throughout all of these industries, which is very concerning and aligned with the information that you had shared.
Very good. Lorena, do you have anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, first of all, thank you. And thank you, Commissioner, for inviting me onto this, as well as having such a distinguished moderator, Dr. Gallardo. Thank you. Um, you know, it's first really important. I mean, we went through some facts really quick, but it's important to understand what those numbers mean. We used, I don't know what number this year on Equal Pay Day, and we say that because it's actually a national number, and there's some discrepancy. Maybe it's 52 to 57, depending on how many hours somebody is working. But what we know is in California, it's much, much worse. So it often shocks people to know, especially with everything we've done in California, we have been successful in reducing the pay gap between white women and overall for women because of that, and white men. However, we have been stagnant on being able to change the pay gap within Latinas. It is a real challenge. That is why when we were in the legislature, we started a committee on unseen Latinas to try to get at what is going on here in California, this great progressive state. We're tackling the issue, and yet it's the largest pay gap of any state California has for Latinas. And while all women, women of color in particular, suffer, Latina women are the most likely to suffer a pay gap. They are the largest pay gap on between themselves and white men. So we have a special kind of situation and problem here. And the commissioner brought it up, but a lot of people think, oh, it's an education gap or there's something about decision making. What we found in California is that Latina surgeons make 44 cents on the dollar of their white male counterpart. A doctor, a specialized doctor. I guarantee she went to school. I guarantee she had to take the same boards. I guarantee she has the same responsibilities in the operating room. And yet she is making so much less than her white male counterpart. What is happening? I think that's the question. And it was interesting. I didn't know the stats on the lowest paid workers actually being the smallest. But one thing I do know, and one thing that gives me hope in California, there are two ways that we know there will be no pay gap for Latinas. If you go into the military service, you end up with the same contract as your white male counterpart. And if you have a union contract, if you're protected by collective bargaining agreement, you're being brought in a standard way and being promoted in a way, not to say that there's never problems with it, but you're much more protected for having equal pay with those two circumstances.
Fascinating. Thank you. And sad at the same time. So Latinas are overrepresented, underpaid, and often lack basic workplace protections in certain industries, such as healthcare, hospitality, and retail. Why do you think this is?
This is a great question. And I think it is important to acknowledge that California has some of the strongest protections in the country, right? As you highlighted in Lorena's introduction, our legislators have been leaders in identifying tools to address the systemic wage theft and retaliation that goes undetected and where workers are struggling to recover what is owed to them. So we do have a lot of laws. I think the question is, why is it that the women in these industries are not exercising these laws? Why they're not exercising these protections, right? And so many workers don't understand what protections that they have. And that's the biggest challenge. If a worker doesn't know their rights, they can't exercise them. And that's one of the reasons I launched our Reaching Every California campaign, because we don't do enough to get out and reach those workers who don't have a voice, who aren't connected to a union, who aren't connected to a worker center or an advocate who could help get to the labor commissioner's office. And we have a duty to make sure that they know what their rights are so they can start to digest that and consider taking on their employer by engaging in a legal dispute, right? By reporting information to us, filing an individual wage claim, or reporting confidential information, and help us identify those cases that go undetected. So education, Dr. Gallardo, is key to getting these workers to understand their protections.
Thank you so much for what your office does. Thank you. And so farm workers and domestic workers were the last two industries to receive access to overtime pay protections in our state. Historically, these jobs have been held by immigrant and undocumented women, making them more vulnerable to wage theft. Lorena, what kind of things these workers should know about if their employer is not following the law? What should they know?
Well, I first want to point out that although for most farm workers, we are now at an 8-hour day, we're still pushing hard for the little crumbs, I guess, if you could say, sheep and goat herders. There are still people in agriculture that don't get an 8-hour day. And domestic workers do not have the same rights as everybody else. We have been trying to get domestic workers to where farm workers and everybody else are. It's an ongoing attempt, but it's important to understand history. To understand, number one, why these workers didn't have the same rights and why they're filled largely now by the newest immigrant, if you will. So when the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in the 1930s, FDR had this great idea. We're going to have some basic labor protections across the whole United States. But in order to get that piece of that included things like minimum wage. And to get that legislation, though, he had to get the votes of some Southern Democrats. They insisted that agricultural and domestic workers were taken out of that. Why? Well, at that time, it was actually children and grandchildren of slaves. It's a vestige of slavery. Those are the jobs that were done and held in, plantations or in people's homes by enslaved individuals. And so the racism that followed out of slavery and the sharecropping continued into the 1930s when these Southerners said, no, they can't, these Black folks cannot be seen as equal to other laborers, if you will. So it was left up to the states. And in California, we've done a good job of bringing those up. It's taken a long time. I mean, I think we did farm worker overtime 2015. And that was a 40-year fight to get just the 8-hour day for farm workers. So we continue to push it. And again, domestic workers don't have those rights. So there's such tenable, we made a decision in the United States of America, number one, that work could be done by stolen labor, completely stolen labor, and then we made a decision that, we got rid of slavery, but we're not going to put the people in those jobs on equal footing with other folks. And as African Americans had different opportunities and could move out of some of those and wanted to because of those substandard wages, we saw it filled with whatever the newest immigrant was. So those jobs, because they're devalued more probably than anything else, and because they're extremely hard, they often go to the most vulnerable, the most desperate, those people who most need to be in this country and be, earning a living, albeit not equal to everybody else.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And so undocumented women are unfortunately more vulnerable at wage theft and sexual harassment. What rights do these women have?
Thank you for that question and for highlighting undocumented workers. It is important to note that in California, all workers have the same protections to being paid the minimum wage, to being paid overtime. Of course, I apologize. Lorena just identified. We do have farm workers of smaller employers who will meet the 8-hour and 40-hour day in 2025. And domestic workers continue on their journey to fight for those protections. But aside from those categories of workers, all of the workers need to be paid legal wages and work under legal conditions. That includes if you are being paid by piece, right? If you're being paid piece rate by box, by a production unit, the employer needs to ensure that you're being paid not less than the minimum wage or the agreed upon rate if it is higher, or the living wage rate of that particular county if it is higher. And all these protections apply to undocumented workers. And in California, we actually have specific protections to protect undocumented workers from illegal immigration related retaliation. So an employer is prohibited from threatening to call the police against them, to file a false police report, to detain them, to false imprisonment, to use their status against them, to threaten to call immigration authorities or the police against a relative or a friend who also has vulnerable immigration situation. And it's important to note that for some of us listening tonight, this may sound outlandish. An employer is not going to file a false police report, is not going to detain an employee, is not going to threaten to have them deported. But sadly, that is common practice in so many of our low wage industries, right? We do have bad faith employers who use immigration status to keep workers silent and isolated and in fear. So I want to be very clear that that is illegal in California. And we have these protections because workers spoke up when they were exercising their rights, and employers did this. And the community went to the legislature and provided testimony. And that's why we have these protections today. So it's because we organized together to have these protections. So if anybody knows of anyone who is experiencing that, please immediately have them contact my office. I will put my email and cell phone in the chat. These are situations that we have to move quickly on, and our team is ready. We have up to a $10,000 penalty per violation that goes to the employee, that goes to the worker who is being retaliated because of their immigration status. And so that's the strength that we have in California's law. The challenge is getting workers to understand that they have this protection and support them in coming forward.
Thank you.
If I can add to that, it's so important. I mean, the number of times I get asked this question, what rights an undocumented worker may have, and it's almost as if people don't believe us. Like every right. Somebody asked me just yesterday, can they join a union? Absolutely, they can join a union. And what the commissioner is saying is absolutely correct. We have the best laws, and on top of that, there is a federal law that are federal regulation. And the commissioner has been helpful with us when we're in an organizing drive, and we know that there are labor issues and people want to come forward, but they're scared because their immigration status. They're actually eligible for deferred action. In other words, they cannot be deported if they come forward. And we've been able to really blanket entire workplaces so that individuals could not be deported anyway. And that even allows, that threat to even it empowers the worker to stand up to that threat even more, because they actually are going to get protected in their status right now under this president, to stay here and file that wage claim and join the union and ensure that they're getting paid correctly. So that's really important. The other thing I want to point out, and I get this question a lot too, with misclassification in AB5. If you are an independent contractor, if somebody is paying you as a 1099 employee, it's likely especially if you're a low wage worker, it's illegal probably. I mean, there are legal independent contractors, but when we're talking about hourly workers, they probably shouldn't be paid with a 1099. But I get this question a lot. The worker didn't do anything wrong. They're not in trouble. So a worker can go to the labor commissioner or even to EDD and ask about why they're receiving a 1099, and they will have no fear of some sort of, I don't know why I get asked a lot of times, like it's some sort of tax thing for them. No, you still have to pay your taxes, but you are not going to get in trouble. It is the employer who is at risk of getting in trouble.
Thank you so much for that clarification. I think it's important that our audience understand their rights. And so occupational segregation is defined as the overrepresentation or underrepresentation of a demographic group in a certain occupation or field. How are Latinas impacted by occupational segregation, and how can we work towards eliminating occupational segregation?
That's a great question and a really tough one. I was thinking about this question and I should have probably looked up the numbers, but we know it exists, right? In fact, when I met the commissioner, she was working on behalf of companies and labor in the janitorial industry. And, we know that most janitors are women. Most of the folks who are cleaning our office buildings, our hospitals, they're women. It's also extremely low wage paid. So the fact that we have shuffled women into this industry, and we've had to work hard to fight against wage theft and subcontracting and misclassification and sexual harassment, everything you can imagine. The only thing that's provided some relief are those unionized companies for those workers. And so, we know it happens. We know it happens in hospitality and retail. And we know that Latina women, and it really, I think, came out in the pandemic. One of the things, the reason Latinas left the workforce were because of the cost of childcare, quite frankly. The childcare and care economy is hurting Latinas in particular because we're more likely to be younger, childbearing age, having kids, going in and out of the workplace because of that. So starting over each time. And when extreme issues happen, like the pandemic, they had to come home and take care of everybody. And so that has been an ongoing issue. And it seems like, yes, it's an issue. How we solve it, we have to continue to raise all workers up. But women, and ensure that every single job, even if it is a female dominated job, that it has the respect, it has a voice on the job, it has equal pay. And I'll give you a great example. There used to be, my mom was the nurse, so I've looked at the nursing profession a lot. She started in the 1960s, late 60s, early 70s, and it was a pink collar career. Number one, it was almost entirely women, and it really was a working class career. However, in California, if you see the increase in unionization in our registered nurse has allowed that pink collar career to really blossom into a good middle class career because of the strength of that union, those unions that represent nurses. Most nurses today, registered nurses in particular, are living a good, solid middle class life. They can afford usually a house and take care of their kids, right? How did that happen? A fully female job, also teachers that used to be predominantly women. Well, it was the help of a union contract, of course, and workers empowering themselves to ensure that they're paid more. Every job should be a good middle class job, and that's what we're fighting for.
I love that.
I'd also like to add that I think part of the solution with this issue of occupational segregation, comes back to breaking the culture of isolation and fear. Right? We do in our history, we do have the fact that workers were punished for talking about their wages and forbidden to talk about their conditions, particularly women, right? And so we have to continue to break that down and understand that today you can absolutely talk about your wages and talk about your conditions, and workers should intentionally do that because bad faith employers want you to feel isolated and fearful and alone. We know that workers are stronger, our communities are stronger when we come together. And so that's a key piece to continuing to break down the segregation that Latinas are facing.
Oh, thank you so much for that information. And so dating back to the 20th century, women primarily worked in the home and were excluded from opportunities and conversations related to the workplace. How have women organized and advocated for equitable opportunities in the workplace?
Would you like to start?
Absolutely. Um, I'm going to share a personal example. As Lorena already mentioned, we know that so many of our workforces are predominantly women. In my agency, we're over 60% female. And in industries like janitorial, right, they too are over 60% female. And so we had an issue in the janitorial industry where we had unreported rapes. We had a lot of sexual violence that happens, but because of the fear in the industry, the vulnerabilities of the workforce, the fact that 70% of the supervisors are men, even though the majority of the workforce are women, right? That all contributes working at night, that all contributes to dangerous hazardous situations where women were being attacked and raped and didn't have the support in their community to do that. So, in collaboration with the union, a nonprofit I worked with, we did engage in working with the women who wanted to do something to expose this. And they organized themselves. They ran a bill that Lorena, then assembly member, sponsored and championed, but they also worked together to empower themselves. Right. So it's amazing how you look at everything happens around a kitchen table sometimes. Right. And so in every community center, every organization I've been in, we are sitting around a cup of coffee and we're talking. Right. But there's planning that's happening, right? It's sharing your story, sharing your struggle, right? To not be alone and isolated, because that's how the bad faith employers win. But when we come together, as the women did in the Ya Basta campaign with the union, that's how they were most successful. And they were actually able to take on this industry and say, enough is enough. We are no longer going to let ourselves be violated and stay silent. And they spoke up. So I think that's one very powerful example that I was able to witness that I think demonstrates how it is women organize in their workplace.
I think that's such a great example. And anyone who has not seen the story, it started, I guess, more problematically. You can see the problem in Rape on the Night Shift. It was a PBS documentary. They did a follow-up after the bill and with the women to show what they did. It was just incredible. I mean, it was transformational to watch these women take something that was so scary, so isolating, so individual, and come together to really turn things, empower themselves to have a voice. It was just, it is one of the best stories I've ever got to see up close. But we do have historical examples of women coming together, organizing for safety. It goes back to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, predominantly women, predominantly immigrant, young women who were forced, of course, to stay inside as they, locked in and ended up jumping, many of them, to their death in New York City. And it started the garment workers. And we still have garment workers fighting for their rights. We've seen it recently in California with some updates and laws that the garment workers pushed, as the commissioner talked about when she came on, peace rape. People don't understand peace rape very much, but we did get some protections for garment workers. They empowered themselves. It was their stories. Actually, I mean, the legislature passes it, but nobody thinks of it unless these workers can come together, can tell their stories, can talk about what they're facing. We've also seen in the hotel industry, largely a lot of women, Latinas in particular, are so often the hotel housekeepers, the service workers at a hotel. And we have seen in the last, I guess, year a series of strikes and actions where these workers are coming together, demanding more in their workplace, and they're getting it. They're going on strike. They're holding these multi-million-dollar corporations accountable to make sure that they have equal pay, to make sure their job is respected. And it's incredible. They also came together, and the commissioner has been done some tremendous work, but the workers came together post-pandemic, or really during the pandemic, to insist and ensure that hotels, as people were being hired back, people were coming back to hotels, that they were doing it by seniority. They were giving workers the right to be recalled, not just go out and find, the next cheapest immigrant labor they could find, but actually give people back their jobs. They said this isn't fair. These were largely Latina women in their 50s who had given their lives to these jobs, and through the pandemic, of course, lost it in the hospitality industry and the tourism industry, but demanded that something be done. We did that at the state level. They got a bill, they got enforcement money, and the commissioner has been, I don't even know how many millions of dollars of fines she's been able to get money back in the hands of these workers and get these workers their jobs back. Amazing, but it is largely women who came together, empowered themselves because they saw something happening that was not right, and demanded more.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So, what are some of the basic rights every woman in California should know? We talked about, being able to share salaries, but what are some of the rights around, say, lactation accommodations? What is the first step when you think about those rights and when they've been violated?
Absolutely. Women do have rights to lactation accommodations. So employers must provide a clean area, clean private area where they could connect to electricity, where they can keep their milk cold, um, and they can use the time that they need. An employer doesn't need to provide additional time. Like if you're pumping and you're on your rest break and you have your 10 minutes and you need more time, they need to give you that time, but they don't need to pay you for that time. So there are those certain limitations. And in the farm industry, again, we have some exemptions. There, because of the nature of some of these farms that you don't have electricity, employers can make accommodations, like have a camper. They still need to provide the private space, but it may not be a building with full electricity, right? Then they have to demonstrate that why they're not able to provide that. And if a woman is not provided with those accommodations, they can file a complaint with my office, and there is a penalty of $100 for each day that an employee is denied these reasonable accommodations. So aside from lactation accommodations, women also have the rights to the meal breaks, the rest breaks, to paid sick leave, right? We mentioned that we're now up to 5 days, 40 hours as of January 1, 2024 of this year, to have a paycheck with all the information, to know the hours that you're working and the rate that you are being paid for each hour. You also have the right to go attend your child's school activities, medical appointments. Medical could be covered by paid sick leave, actually, but around school activities, you do have the right to say, I have a parent teacher conference and I'm going to miss 2 hours of my shift. Now, the issue with that labor code protection is the employer doesn't pay for that. However, it's important to know you have the right to do that, to take that time off and come back without fear of retaliation to their job. And I think particularly as we've acknowledged to lower paid earners who are caring for their family, they miss out on so many things of their child's life, of their parent experience, right? Of their family experience, because they don't realize that they have this protection, or they have a bad faith employer that says, oh yeah, you're going to take 2 hours off, but don't come back tomorrow. That's retaliatory if an employer would do that. So it's so important that we're talking about these. And if anybody has any questions, they could reach my office and we could help answer those.
I think those retaliation protections are really important for people to understand. It's that you don't just have the right to utilize these laws, the laws against discrimination, against harassment, the right to take paid sick leave, all of these things. But any form of retaliation, that means if you are normally scheduled for day shifts and you get moved to night shifts, or you stop getting scheduled, as the commissioner said, or you're in other ways retaliated against. The presumption in sick days is if any of that happens, it's presumed to be because you took a sick day. So the employer, in fact, if he or she fired somebody, would have to prove that it had nothing to do. That it was a reason outside of that. They'd have to prove that they had cause. And that's pretty good for a just cause, no just cause state in letting go of people. So we put a lot of protections in. And on that sick days, I mean, there are things people are always shocked by, but it's true. You do not have to give your employer time. Like, you can actually call in. I know, as a mom and having taken care of kids, I've been on the way to take my kid to school and they throw up, and you can't take them in. You can use your sick day to stay home with your child, and you can call your work and tell them at that moment. You don't have to provide a doctor's note. And so unless it's 5 days in a row, that is when, I mean, there's just all of these things that really are to protect the worker. And the labor commissioner's office is the expert on all of these rules. But again, we're back to education. People need to know their rights in the workplace.
And Dr. Gallardo, I would like to add that it is important that workers not wait till they have a problem. Right? We need to develop a militant, disciplined habit of knowing everything about our employer. We need to understand that relationship of an individual giving their mind, heart, and body to an employer in their labor is a significant commitment. So if you don't have an employer cell phone, if they're not responsive, if you don't have an address, you're in trouble. Those are all red flags that people should be mindful of. Do you really want to continue working with this employer who's not respecting you as a human being? So you should want to know everything about the employer, where to locate them, how their organization is structured. Take note of who gives you orders, who could influence your working conditions, who they contract with, who their vendors are, because reconstructing once you have a problem, it is so difficult. People are stressed out. You just want to move on to the next job, right? You forget things. It's traumatic experience. So it's important, just like brushing our teeth every day, workers need to document, know who their employer is, and just keep that information handy. That way, when you get into a problem, you're ready to act.
Well, I think that's the key takeaway. Know your rights. Really research employers so that you know who it is that you're going to work for. We have a right to have that information. Very good. And so as workers are finding out, their rights and they're researching, what if they're part-time or seasonal employees? Is there someone they should call to find out those rights? But also, there's language barriers oftentimes. Is there information in more than just one language?
Yes, absolutely. We have a duty. The state has to provide interpretation services to make sure that workers are being understood and that they understood what we are communicating to them. So, as a state, we make an effort and we need to do better to have bilingual staff. That is a priority in our hiring efforts. Those languages that we do not have staff, we have language lines that are available. But a real key strategy to language justice is working with community leaders in these industries, in these sectors who have that language within their ranks. And so we provide, for example, in farm worker areas in the Imperial Valley, in the Central Coast, and the Central Valley, we do community clinics where we partner with community leaders who are, this is being translated in Mixteco or it's being translated in Triqui. And I'm actually very proud to be, I think, one of the rare labor commissioners that is fluent. I am very pocha at times, but I am fluent in Spanish and I prioritize Spanish engagement for them to hear directly from somebody in their language and be able to ask their questions. And we have to create that psychological safety. You know, when you're always working through an interpreter, there's some challenges with that. But understanding that workers taking on their boss, doesn't matter how little or how high your pay is, that's intimidating. It's not transactional. It's something that we as a government agency have to understand that it's intimidating and we need to provide the support and work with our community leaders to support workers in moving forward through that investigation and in filing their cases. So we are working on reaching more languages. And while we do that, we work with community partners. With respect to your question around working part-time, you know, if you're part-time, full-time, that you have these same protections. Everything we've been talking about, you have the right to paid sick leave, right? Your allocation of hours, your accumulation, sorry, of hours may be longer for you to get there because you're working less time if it's on an allocation formula. But you have, if you are a part-time worker, you are protected and should come forward with whatever questions that you have.
Yeah, I wanted to point that out. Seasonal and part-time workers. Now, there are a few tiny exceptions. If you read the wage orders and labor code, very, very, very small. Like if you're a campaign worker, you're not going to earn unemployment insurance. It's an old exemption. I'm not sure why that's in seasonal. There are some different kind of exemptions for people who work in ski slopes somehow. That was something that was done like in the 1970s and still exists. Very, very few though. So when you think, a lot of times people say, well, I was just hired for the holiday season. I don't get these things. Yes, you do. You qualify for anything that anybody else would. Again, time sensitive. And so that's an important piece. Part-time, just because you're seasonal and you're working for like the Christmas season, that doesn't mean you're wrapping presents or doing something like that. That doesn't mean they can pay you as an independent contractor. That doesn't mean that they can not pay you overtime if you spend more than 8 hours in a shift. So these are all really important questions, and people have to realize in California, we don't really make much difference between how many hours a week you're working, unless it's some kind of larger benefits like paid family leave.
And let me also add, Dr. Gallardo, that especially in industries like the warehouse industry, we've seen a huge growth in California of personal employee organizations and staffing agencies, not just in warehouse, but in other sectors as well. And oftentimes workers think like, oh, well, I'm employed by the staffing agency, so I don't have the same rights, right? And that's not true, right? The staffing agency is one of your employers. You could also, it's important for workers to understand, you could have more than one employer. If there's more than one entity who is controlling your pay and your working conditions and giving you orders on what to do, they may be an employer. So it's important to make note of all that. So if you're working for a leasing agency, a staffing agency, a personal employee organizations, those are all potential employers, and they have the obligation to make sure you have the legal conditions at work.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And so something near and dear to my heart is equity in education attainment. And although Latinas are earning degrees at high rates, the pay gap has not improved. Why aren't Latinas making more than the average income than their white male counterparts?
It's such an important question, and again, one we keep searching for an answer to. I used the example earlier about Latina surgeons. That's probably as highly educated as you can be, and knowing that you're serving at a disadvantage just because you're Latina. We see it in law. We see it in companies. There has just been, for whatever reason, an ability, and employers have taken advantage of that to pay Latinas less, even those who are highly educated in careers that require a very robust education. And that's something I think that some of our laws, like Monique Limon passed, and some of our transparency laws, we're hopeful will start to address. It's a much easier target to address, we think, in kind of some of those fields. And so some of the laws that have been passed over the last few years, hopefully will start to make a difference, at least in those jobs.
And I do think, Dr. Gallardo, that I think as we've been talking about, we acknowledge that these issues are symptomatic of institutional racism and gender discrimination and socioeconomic disparity, right? So it doesn't just focus on one aspect of the pay gap, and so it is very disturbing that we learn that even though you go out and pursue, as Lorena's example of the surgeon, you're still facing these walls, right? Or those glass ceilings, right? And also on upward mobility. So I think it's important to remember we have to work together, right? And we have to look at addressing the entire system and the entire issues, and not believe that we'll be able to fix one piece of it, right? While other pieces continue to be broken. So it's about looking at addressing all, right? How are we reaching equity within the educational systems, within family planning, within the workforces?
I think too,
Thank
we
you.
have to talk about regionalization just a little bit, because one of the things we always kind of get thrown at us in California is, oh, come on, if you're in the Central Valley, you don't need to be making as much as if you're in Los Angeles. Well, first of all, the housing costs everywhere are out of control. But because of that, you see the disparity in pay for even for jobs that require a very strong education in areas that are outside of kind of suburban areas, sometimes are less. And that's where a lot of our Latinas are in the rural Central Valley, in the Inland Empire, places where employers, they're disproportionately located, and employers are willing to and able to pay less.
Thank you. So we've talked about, various components of Latina pay, but what do you think is the best approach to close the pay gap for Latinas?
I may sound like a broken record, but I just think it's about education. It's about working together, and understanding that we're stronger. And we have to reach young workers, right? We haven't talked about young workers, right? But another part of our Reaching Every California campaign is our youth advocate program, right? Of getting into the high schools, right? We wait once they come out and we think, oh, there's going to be time. But that's not true. Life just keeps happening, right? And especially in our first generation families, so many of these youth, with their English skills, are helping negotiate, to get their parents back wages, helping address a problem that their parent is having, right? So when we educate the youth, we are also educating the whole family. It has to be a family affair, right? Everybody needs to understand what their rights are. So I think we need to have a strategy to get to young people. And we also have to consider well-being. We have to consider confidence, right? And self-esteem.
Absolutely.
Because that's something, as we all know, right, as three Latinas on this screen, right, that it takes hits over the years. And some of us aren't necessarily raised understanding that we're powerful. And the fact is that we are. Every human being is powerful, right? So I think as a state, we have to work at continuing to enforce the law and making sure we have the tools that we need to be able to respond to every worker and build new pathways. But we also have to invest in education and getting to youth early, right? And making sure that parents, mom and dads are not having, moms aren't having to choose between their family or their job, right? Or their family or investing in their career, right? and improving people's well-being overall so that they understand it doesn't matter how you're treated at work, you are more valuable. And I shouldn't say it doesn't matter, it does matter. But too often that's internalized and then it reiterates negative messages, right? And self esteem is really impacted. And we need to come together to lift that up, lift each other up, and understand that we're stronger when we work together.
And I think you can pull that into what I think is always the best solution, and that is to have more unions and more women in unions, more Latinas in unions. We know that a Latina who has a union contract makes more than $6 an hour more than a Latina in the same field in the same location that doesn't have a union contract. So the union difference really does matter. It pulls people out of poverty, and it ensures that there is equal pay. And the other thing is enforcement. You know, we've been talking about, like, what do you do when your employer does bad stuff, right? What do you do? And we put so much pressure on the commissioner's office and on Lilia, because that is what we do. You know, oh, you can get an attorney. What if you don't know an attorney? You know, you can call our office and we'll send you to Lilia's office. You know, I mean, it really all comes back to her. We've been trying to empower city attorneys and DAs to get involved as well. But ultimately, the beautiful thing about a union contract, a CBA, a collective bargaining agreement in a workplace, is that's enforced by the actual workers themselves. They get to learn the contract and demand it, and they have an institution to back them up if anything goes wrong. There is a system in place for self-enforcement. That is a great thing. We see it a lot in the building trades with prevailing wage. Enforcement comes actually from the union. Of course, they have to report it, but it's much easier for our agencies to have the time to work on areas, in fact, that are non-unionized, when we're able to, within workplaces where it's most appropriate, to unionize and ensure that those women's rights are taken care of from day one.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Lilia and Lorena, for your words of empowerment and confidence to Latinas across California and beyond our borders. I just want to thank you for providing us with insight on the experiences of Latinas in the workplace. Thank you to our audience members for attending the California Commission on the Status of Women and Girls Latina Equal Pay Day educational briefing. This educational briefing will be available on our website at women.ca.gov. And we invite you to visit our website to learn more about the California Equal Pay Pledge. And this pledge is really focused on transparency by employers who are committed to this project by the first partner, Jennifer Steibel Newsom, the Commission and the California Partners Project, to close gender and racial pay gaps in California. Thank you again to our panelists, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.